At some point, something subtle happens. You realize you're telling the same story as everyone else. Not because you agreed to it, not because you chose it, but because it sounds familiar. You hear yourself explaining your life in phrases you didn't create, describing the world with words that feel borrowed, reacting to events using conclusions that arrived fully formed, finished. You don't remember deciding this version of things. You only remember how easily it came out of your mouth. That's just how it is. That's how the system works. There's nothing you can do. These sentences appear everywhere. In conversations, in headlines, in personal reflections that no longer feel personal. They don't sound forced. They sound reasonable. And that's what makes them dangerous, because stories don't need to be imposed to spread. They only need to feel complete. A finished narrative offers comfort. It removes uncertainty. It gives you something to hold on to when reality feels complex. So people adopt it not as belief, but as expiation. You start noticing how quickly events are wrapped into meaning, how fast ambiguity disappears, how rarely questions are allowed to stay open. Before observation has time to settle, the story arrives. It tells you who's responsible, what matters, what doesn't, and most importantly, how you're supposed to feel about it. At first, it feels helpful. Stories help us navigate chaos. They reduce noise. They make the world easier to digest. But something changes when every situation comes prepackaged. You stop looking. You stop listening. You stop noticing what doesn't fit, because the story already explains everything. When someone hesitates, they're told they're over. When someone questions the narrative, they're labeled difficult. When someone refuses to repeat it, they're treated like a problem, not attacked, just ignored. And so, the safest move becomes obvious. You repeat what's already accepted. You borrow language that won't cause friction. You align your interpretation with the version that moves smoothly through the room. Not because it's true, but because it's finished. Unfinished stories make people uncomfortable. They create pauses. They demand attention. Finished stories let everything keep moving. And most people choose movement over clarity. This is how narratives spread without force. Not through censorship, not through commands, but through convenience. The story arrives already shaped, already simplified, already emotionally coded. All you have to do is repeat it, and the more you repeat it, the more it feels like your own. Until, one day, you pause and realize the story you're telling about your life, about the world, about what's possible, isn't something you remember writing. The human mind is not comfortable with uncertainty. It never was. When information is incomplete, the brain doesn't wait patiently. It fills the gaps, not with facts, with stories. Stories reduce cognitive effort. They turn complexity into sequence. They transform chaos into cause and effect. This is why narratives feel calming. They give shape to events that would otherwise remain unresolved. They offer meaning where there is ambiguity. They provide emotional direction when reality feels unstable. And once a story feels coherent, the brain relaxes. That relaxation is important, because uncertainty triggers vigilance, and vigilance is exhausting. So when a ready-made narrative appears, the mind doesn't challenge it. It welcomes Italiano not because it's accurate, but because it's complete. Finished narratives feel safe. They remove the burden of interpretation. They tell you what matters, what doesn't, and how to feel about it. This is why repetition is so powerful. The more often a story is repeated, the more familiar it becomes. And familiarity is mistaken for truth. The brain confuses recognition with understanding. Soon, hearing the story again doesn't feel like persuasion. It feels like confirmation, and confirmation feels reassuring. Over time, narratives begin to shape perception itself. You don't just repeat the story. You start noticing reality through it. Details that fit are remembered. Details that don't are dismissed. Contradictions are softened or ignored, not deliberately, automatically. This is how narratives become invisible. Once a story is internalized, it no longer feels external. It feels like common sense. Questioning it begins to feel unnecessary, even uncomfortable, because questioning reopens uncertainty, and uncertainty demands effort. So most people don't resist narratives. They settle into them. They adopt language that smooths conversation. They repeat explanations that move quickly. They avoid interpretations that might slow things down, not because they're being controlled, but because their minds are doing what they were designed to do: reduce friction, preserve energy, maintain coherence. The problem isn't that humans tell stories. The problem is that, at some point, stories start telling humans how to see, and once perception is guided by narrative, observation becomes secondary. Reality doesn't disappear, but it's filtered, shaped, edited, and by the time you notice something doesn't quite fit, the story has already moved on, leaving very little room to ask where it came from or who decided how it should end. Once a narrative settles in, it stops feeling like a story. It feels like reality. That's the shift most people miss, because narratives don't announce when they cross that line. They don't say, "This is interpretation." They don't warn you when explanation replaces observation. They simply become the default lens. From that point on, choices narrow quietly, not because alternatives are forbidden, but because imagining them feels unnecessary. Why question what already makes sense? Why pause when the story moves smoothly? Why look closer when the explanation feels complete? This is how narratives begin to govern behavior without force. They don't tell you what to do. They tell you what's reasonable. They define the boundaries of acceptable thought. They decide which questions are productive and which are dismissed as noise. And once those boundaries are internalized, no enforcement is needed. People correct themselves. They adjust tone. They refine language. They avoid interpretations that might feel disruptive. Not out of fear, out of efficiency. Because moving with the narrative is easier than resisting it. The danger isn't that narratives exist, it's that they arrive finished. When a story is complete, there's no space left for noticing what doesn't fit. No room for ambiguity, no patience for slow observation. Everything must resolve quickly, and in that rush, subtle details disappear. Complexity is flattened, contradictions are absorbed, silences are filled, until the story feels airtight. At that point, repeating it feels like understanding, and understanding feels like control. But it's not control. It's containment, contained perception, contained imagination, contained possibility. The most effective narratives don't demand loyalty. They don't ask for belief. They simply make alternatives hard to see. And when alternatives are invisible, choice becomes theoretical. You can still decide, but only within the story. You, Bay, Ben, Jaben. That's why narrative control doesn't feel like domination. It feels like clarity. It feels like being informed, like being realistic, like being grounded. But clarity, without observation, is fragile, because the moment reality shifts outside the narrative, confusion returns. And when confusion returns, people look for a new story. Not to understand, but to restore comfort. This is the cycle. Conformity prepares the ground. Narrative fills the space. Memory adjusts afterward, and most never notice the transition, because the most effective stories are the ones you don't remember choosing. Before you leave, take a second to check if you'll resubscribe it. Most people think they are. They usually aren't.